Good evening, good morning, good afternoon, and good evening to some of the participants from Israel. We have a wonderful participation from across the country. My name is Dina Waktel. I'm Vice President for Community Affairs at Canadian Friends of Hebrew University, and it is my great pleasure to welcome you to this special session. Before we begin, I want to thank my colleague Ayala Davis for helping make today's program possible. A quick note for everyone joining us, you're welcome to submit questions throughout the session in the Q&A box, and we will try to address as many of them as possible toward the later part of the program. Now, we are deeply honored to have with us Ambassador Ido Aharoni, a distinguished diplomat, scholar, and global strategic thinker. Ambassador Aharoni served for over 25 years in Israel's foreign service, including as Israel's consul general in New York, the longest tenure in that position, overseeing Israel's largest diplomatic mission worldwide. He's widely regarded as a pioneer of Israel's nation branding and public diplomacy strategy, and has since continued to shape conversations about international affairs, national identity, innovation, and Israel's role on the global stage. He currently serves as a Global Distinguished Professor at Touro University and previously taught at NYU, continuing to split his time between Israel and New York, remaining deeply engaged in policy diplomacy and thought leadership. Today's topic, Israel and the Middle East, the road ahead. Ambassador Aharoni, it is a true pleasure to welcome you back. The floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Dina, and the honor is obviously all mine. It's always such a pleasure to address this esteemed group, and I see just by looking at the names that again we have people, uh, from all over the place. I see from Israel, from the West Coast, from the East Coast. So it's great to be with you. Let me, as I always do, share some slides with you so that we can have some visuals that will help us to jump into the subject matter. So the past 2 years have been very dramatic, and I would say that in order for us to begin the conversation about how the events of 10/7 and post 10/7 have been transformational, let's first talk about what is happening in the world. There are largely two things that are affecting everything that we see. The first is obviously the impact of technology. Technology is driving massive change. And that change, of course, is in the form of the unprecedented amount of information that is created by human beings. All of us are publishers by definition. Also, there's a reversal of roles that is occurring. We're also the product. So if in the past we were, was just saw yesterday, a very inexpensive phone offered by Walmart, of one of the well-known American brands. And it turns out that the reason this phone is so inexpensive, smartphone, is because it's basically loaded with apps that follow you. So basically, the idea is to flood the market with products that allow the brands to collect information about us. So what they're mining is us. They're mining our time, our attention, they're mining our bandwidth, they're mining our brains, and so on and so forth. Information overload is known as the phenomenon of too much irrelevant information, as we also know too much white noise and too little signal. The distinction between white noise and signal is essential because this is really what's at the heart of the rise of populism and the rise of what we now know is a lack of critical thinking, lack of complexity, and so on. And we've discussed this before in various forums, but the idea is very simple. The human brain was never designed to handle such a volume of information. As a result, the human brain is constantly seeking simple solutions to highly complex problems. The algorithm, which is based on only two options, black or white, plus or minus, good or evil, oppressed or oppressors, is pushing us to adopt a binary worldview, a binary view of reality, which means, again, no complexity, no ability to contain nuance, and so on and so forth. Combination of all of that creates what the philosophers now called the rise of the age of ignorance, or the rise of the age of stupidity, where intelligent people, people that have many diplomas, people that are well educated, believe in stupid things. And the reason is not because they're stupid. The reason is because they are consuming information mindlessly, without deploying any critical thinking. So that's one major phenomenon. By the way, and AI will only make things worse, because again, people will simply do things automatically, accept positions automatically, express views out of position rather than out of actually a thorough examination of what those views actually mean. And I can tell you, as a university professor, it's a real problem, even at the university level, where people come to institutions to supposedly learn, but what you discover is that many of those kids come to actually acquire diplomas, acquire academic credentials, rather than engage in a true process of learning, although not all students are like that, thank God. And then the other thing that is happening in parallel is the introduction of a new world order. Two things to be said about that. The first is, this is not really starting with Donald Trump. It's very important to understand that the decision of the Americans to disengage from the New World Order that they themselves introduced, and I'll say about that as something in a second, started, according to some historians, during the second term of George W. Bush. So what is that New World Order that the United States, in a very sophisticated fashion, introduced in 1945? In 1945, and I should say even in 1944, when the Allied forces were preparing for the victory in Europe and in the Pacific, the idea was for the United States, and it was inspired by some brilliant economists, including one particular British economy, Maynard Keynes, who said, why not do something that was never done before? Throughout history, when empires conquered and defeated their enemies, historically and traditionally, they used to occupy their land, they used to enslave their people, of course, exploit their natural resources, and so on and so forth. But the Americans didn't do it. The Americans and the British didn't do it. It was clear that the Soviet Union is not going to be part of that world order. So the Americans and the British decided to turn to those nations who were defeated and offer them an incredibly sophisticated deal. If you think about it in terms of how empires behaved in history, it was incredibly sophisticated. They said, we're not going to conquer you, we're not going to destroy you, we're not going to enslave you, we're not going to exploit your natural resources. What we're going to do is actually help you to rebuild. But we're going to help you to rebuild by introducing a matching program, which was the Marshall Plan. And then in addition to that, you are going to agree to accept our currency as the main currency, and you are going to agree to accept to be part of our group of like-minded people, what is known today as the Green Bucket. The Green Bucket are the countries that are like-minded. So the United States put itself in a position of trade disadvantage to make it happen. And after several decades, when the Americans themselves initiated the inclusion of the Chinese in the World Trade Organization, which was the umbrella organization setting tariffs and so on, it became pretty evident that the United States very rapidly is losing its positioning, not only as a world-leading manufacturing power, which was the case until the 1960s or the early 1970s, but also that there is a new Cold War forming. Only this time, instead of the Soviet Union, it's China, and the Europeans are not being very helpful. For example, the Europeans are not spending enough on their own defense, yet they're spending way too much on social welfare. So the Americans say, wait a second, this is unfair. we are in a disadvantage in terms of trade relations. And indirectly, we are funding your incredible social welfare system, and we are also funding your defense. So, for example, if there's a war between Russia and Ukraine, we, the Americans, feel it is your responsibility, not just ours, to protect Ukraine against Russian aggression and so on and so forth. So this is really what's at the heart of this new world order that is being introduced. And make no mistake, it is a new world order that where bilateralism is going to replace multilateralism. And we may even go back to the pre-World War I situation of what's called the spheres of influence, where large countries were somewhat, allowed to do whatever they see fit within their sphere of influence, their region. And so the United States, I believe, under Trump is saying we are overstretched if we are to effectively cope with China as part of the new world Cold War. We have to reconfigure our presence globally, and we have to engage in a system of bilateral agreements with countries, and that way we can more effectively deal with the problem with China. So that's just the big picture. What is happening in the world? Of course, it's affecting Israel in a very big way because Israel is being viewed always as part of the green bucket. The green bucket are like-minded countries. This is post-World War II. The red bucket, countries that are opposing the American position, led historically by the Soviet Union. Today, it's being led by Russia and China. India is kind of undecided, but we know that other countries like South Africa, certainly North Korea joined the green bucket, the red bucket, and then of course you have the yellow bucket, which are the undecided nations. So 10-7 turns out 2 years later really triggered a regional transformation. In what sense? The first thing is in terms of Israel itself. 10-7 changed Israel, I would say, to the core. And I'm not necessarily referring to the the domestic social situation, what is happening in Israel internally. I'm referring, first of all, to Israeli policy. I can't envision a government in Israel's future that will develop any kind of tolerance towards the rearming of any of the elements of the anti-Israel front, anti-American front that Israel faced on 10-7. In other words, zero tolerance means that Israel will not accept the idea that a group, a terrorist organization, whether Hamas or Hezbollah or any other group, will amass military capacities and weapons along its borders. It's not going to happen again. And no matter the price, and the price is heavy reputationally. Israel is in a position in terms of its own reputation that I think I can't think of a situation in our past. During the Second Intifada, there were allegations of genocide in Jenin, if you remember. There were certainly arguments that Israel was using military force disproportionately, if you remember, after the Second Intifada. And the Second Intifada, in terms of the cost in lives and fatalities, was almost like 10-7, only it was over the course of 4.5 years, right? So we lost nearly 1,500 people, 75% of them civilians, during the Second Intifada. Like today, travel was zero, really, went down to zero. And like today, we were accused of genocide and all those things, but I would say it was a different intensity. And again, social media, the algorithm, that vicious, merciless algorithm wasn't so formidable, wasn't so prominent as it is today. So the first thing that I would say is part of that transformational, um, um, you know, 10-7 triggered a transformation in the region. The big element in that transformation, you could see that in Israel's decision to attack in Qatar. right? So they say that the United States was unaware of it. I don't really know the truth. I find it hard to believe that the Americans did not know. But let's assume that the Americans did not know. The very fact that Israel decided to do it, it shows zero tolerance to any sign even of aggression or hostility or any and you could say that it also symbolizes a dangerous addiction of Israel to military force, that the deployment of military force becomes the default, and that's a fair point, which I'm happy to discuss. The other thing that you can say, again, incredible, is the social resilience that you see all over the country, especially in the periphery. Israelis, on the one hand, on October 8th, were shocked at the fact that civilians were fulfilling the role of the government in many cases. And they were shocked at the degree of the fracture in the political system, the depth of the fragmentation, again, thanks to the algorithm that is pitting us against each other in the Israeli society. Israel is exposed, just like many other Western countries, to influence campaigns launched by Russia, China, Iran, and other elements in the anti-American axis. So most important element to understand about Israel's transformation is, again, the fact that Israel is, from now on, you'll see zero tolerance. And you look at what happened to the elements of the so-called Iranian Ring of Fire. Just to remind those of you who forgot, this was something that Yahya Sinwar was counting on. Luckily for Israel, and fortunately for all of us, it didn't happen. It didn't happen because he did not fully coordinate with them. Apparently, he was too paranoid to share his operational plans with his ideological partners. And as a result, when 10/7 happened, with the exception of Hezbollah and to a lesser extent the Houthis, there was no real orchestrated attack against Israel as Yahya Sinwar had hoped. So what happened to the elements of the Ring of Fire? All of them, to a certain degree, you could say were militarily defeated in Israel, although certainly it is not what the Israeli leadership promised, the eradication of Hamas, which, if you remember, right after 10/7, we had a discussion here, and I said that to say that you're going to eradicate a mindset is not a serious commitment, and it cannot be done. And indeed, it hasn't happened. What happened was Israel significantly crippled the military capacity of Hamas, but Hamas could try and rebuild unless an effective intervention will take place on the ground. Same thing can be said about Hezbollah. Hezbollah suffered a major blow from Israel. But again, if there is no follow-up, if there is no ability to take advantage of the military victory politically in terms of policy, then Hezbollah will have the time to rebuild and regroup. Same thing goes for Iran's nuclear program. Iran suffered a major blow. Iran's, and by the way, and about Iran, most people don't understand that the real blow was not necessarily in June, but rather in December of 2024. If you remember, the Iranians attacked Israel twice. In April, October of 2024, the Israeli response to those attacks was so devastating that it basically took out Iran's entire air defense apparatus. As a result, when Israel launched the attack in June of the 12-day war, the so-called 12-day war with Iran, Iran was basically a sitting duck. It's true that they were able to inflict major harm on Israeli home front with ballistic missiles, but Israel inflicted dramatic damage on Iran, and of course, then the Americans intervened, the finale of the 12-day war, to end that episode. And I'll just leave it to you as a food for thought. What would have happened, or what could have happened, if Donald Trump had decided not to intervene at the very end of the 12-day war? The Houthis are still there. They are, again, they haven't attacked in recent days. It doesn't mean that they will not attack Israel. Um, I always say about the Houthis what I said about ISIS, although Houthis are certainly more formidable power than ISIS. In fact, of all the elements in the Ring of Fire, the Houthis are perhaps the most difficult to handle because, first of all, of the geographical distance, the size, and the fact that they're armed with highly sophisticated weapons. The terrain, they're in a area of mountains in Yemen, hiding in caves, very, very difficult to inflict harm on them. And they're in a position to really agitate Israel and disrupt global trade, if you may, which is something that the Americans try to stop and then, for some reason, drop that mission. But I always said about the Houthis what I said about ISIS many, many years ago. Those of you who heard me talk about ISIS many years ago, I said it, and that the only thing that stands between the Houthis and annihilation is an American decision. The idea that a small group is able to disrupt global trade is not sustainable. Just as the idea that several tens of thousands of ISIS people will control the territories the size of Texas was not not sustainable. So once the Americans decided to do away with ISIS, it took about 6 months, but ISIS was gone. Again, as a mindset, it still exists out there. You'll find people associated with ISIS, and you'll find people that say, I did it in the name of ISIS, and so on. The same thing goes for the Houthis. If the Americans will decide to seriously tackle the issue of the Houthis without putting boots on the ground, they can basically stop the bleeding that the Houthis are inflicting on the rest of the Western world. Um, the other elements were surprisingly quiet. The Arab Israelis, um, largely due to the fact that many Israelis, especially Bedouins, but many Arab Israelis were killed by Hamas on October 7th. The West Bank was relatively quiet, still is relatively quiet, and that is largely the fact, we'll talk about that in a few minutes, that the Palestinian Authority actually is upholding the agreement that was signed with Israel in 1993 and 1995. And then the armed militias in the Golan Heights, the pro-Iranian armed militias, as you know, indirectly, Israel's military actions and Israel's military success indirectly brought down also the Assad regime, and now we have a regime in Syria. We still don't know exactly what is the nature of that regime. One of the tests will be whether they will form a government in Syria that will have fair representation to all the various minority groups. If that will happen in Syria, if that will happen, then we will know that we can open a new page with the Syrians. But so far, the best thing that we can hope for is some sort of security coordination or security collaboration. Another striking fact is the endurance of past agreements in light of what is being perceived, at least in the West, as as unacceptable behavior of Israel's military. And again, not in all countries in the West, not in all demographics in the West, but certainly when you look at the intellectual elite, when you look at the mainstream media in classic Europe, certainly in places in the United States and Canada, for sure in Canada, then you can say Israel's response to 10/7 gradually became less and less popular, and at a certain point, people turned hostile towards Israel. Yet, if you look at the region itself, hasn't really happened. The agreements, past agreements with Egypt, with Jordan, with the UAE, with Bahrain, with the Palestinian Authority, are enduring. They're surviving. And here you have a list of all the countries. When we say the Abraham Accords, people have a tendency to forget that they also include Morocco and Sudan, and Bahrain and UAE and the Palestinian Authority. It's very interesting that they continue to collaborate with Israel despite of everything. Situation in the West Bank could have been much worse if not for the security collaboration of the Palestinian Authority with the Israelis. When we talk about a transformed region, the new Middle East, we're talking about the fact that despite of everything, we are still having some serious talks about normalization between Israel and other Arab countries. So again, it's one thing to hear what those leaders say to the media, but it's entirely different thing to see what is actually happening on the ground. Look at Lebanon, for example, where the central government was historically very weak, is actively trying to disarm Hezbollah. If that happens, Lebanon may have a future, may have a horizon, may be able to begin a new chapter. And remember, Lebanon since 1975 has been really was suffocated by the countries around Lebanon, beginning with Syria. Then, of course, Israel's invasion in 1982, Syria in 1975. Before that, Fatah, which took the role of Hezbollah, 69, Fatah is pushed out of Jordan. They're settling in southern Lebanon, creating what is known as Fatah land, engaging in constant attack against Israelis. If you think that the Hamas invented massacring children, I urge all of you to go and Google up the attacks in Ma'alot and Kiryat Shmona, where Fatah attacked children in elementary schools in those towns. I remember that very vividly. So Lebanon may have a future if Lebanon is able to disarm Hezbollah. The Saudis are still, at least the Americans are talking about it, but Saudis are still at play for normalizing ties with Israel. The motivation here, of course, is the realization of Saudi Arabia that they have to transition their economy to a knowledge-based economy. Syria itself, again, I still give a chance to the new regime in Syria. I had a chance to hear the new leader of Syria in New York a few weeks ago, and I was actually I was quite impressed by the fact that this person that came from, he was not educated at Harvard, has strong instincts, and he knows what is expected of him to say. Of course, the proof of the pudding is in the eating, as we all know. So let's see what kind of government he is going to structure, and if he's going to give the minorities a seat around the table, that would be a good sign, not just for Syria, but also a good sign for the entire region. Indonesia, again, Indonesia has been in play for normalization since the days of the late Itzhak Rabin. I remember that shortly after Itzhak Rabin signed the Oslo Accords in the White House, he traveled to Indonesia in an official delegation. So in Indonesia, the largest Muslim country in the world, is still in play. And then, of course, a long shot is to resume ties with Qatar. Israel had diplomatic ties with Qatar. Again, people don't remember that, but during the Second Intifada, when all the Arab countries were retreating from ties with Israelis, the Qataris actually had an Israeli diplomatic mission in Doha. And the Qataris were very involved with Arab Israelis. In fact, there's a football stadium in Israel named the Doha Stadium until this very day. And then, of course, two other countries that are long shots in the normalization scheme. One is Iraq, and the other, of course, is Libya. The precondition there is to see some stability forming within those countries before there's anything happening. But nothing will happen without the involvement of the United States, and we'll talk about that in a second. Now, it's important to understand that when we're talking about peace, and I was amused to see how some media outlets in the West describe President Trump's brokered ceasefire as peace. When you talk about peace in the Middle East, it's very important to understand we're not talking about peace in the standard utopian terms. So peace between Israel and Arab countries is never like peace between, let's say, Canada and Denmark, or peace between, I don't know, Germany and France that had 600 years of hostilities, and today there is peace between Germany and France in its utopian form. In the Middle East, peace means a form of non-belligerency. That's what it means. There's a big difference between peace and normalization. Normalization is let's have normal ties, let's be functional without killing each other. That's the notion of peace. So when you talk about peace in the Middle East, you're essentially talking about a set of livable arrangements. Let me remind you, we signed peace treaty with Egypt 1979. Until this very day, not even one Israeli book was translated into Arabic and distributed in Egypt. Not one. Not even one Israeli movie was shown in Egypt since 1979. Then on the other hand, when the Iranians attacked Israel in April of 2024, the Americans put together a coalition of several countries to help Israel's air defense system. In that coalition, we could see, believe it or not, the Saudis and active participation of the Jordanian army. That's the meaning of peace in the Middle East. So it's not going to be like the peace that you have with Denmark or with Sweden. It is more like what Israel had with Egypt since 1979. Also, remember this, usually the governments, the decision makers, are in favor of normalizing ties with Israel. But normalization with Israel usually does not enjoy the support of the grassroots. UAE is the exception, not the rule in the Middle East. In the case of the UAE, Israelis are very much welcomed by the people too. And again, because the UAE is very different. You have 2 million Emiratis plus 8 million people that they hire to work at the UAE. And so the UAE is very different. Israel is still highly unpopular among the people of Egypt, highly unpopular among the people of Jordan. About 72% of them are of Palestinian origin. United States has taken the lead in a very big way. I would say unprecedented. Those of you who heard me about a year ago, 9 months ago, right after Trump returned to the White House, I said that given the constellation, the configuration, and the makeup of the Israeli coalition, I don't see any other way but eventually and ultimately and inevitably for Trump to dictate a solution for the Israelis. And that's exactly what we see. I said it publicly several times that Trump will end up dictating a solution for the Israelis. And the reason, of course, is very simple. The current coalition in Israel doesn't really allow the prime minister any maneuverability. And the only way for him to present some progress is by saying this is an external pressure. We have no other choice. And indeed, Israel has no other choice but to do what the Americans want them to do at this point in the game. And of course, Mr. Trump would like to disengage from global affairs, but on the other hand, he also would like to be able to present some achievements. He promised to broker deals, and if you remember when he re-entered the White House, he had three big issues to deal with, and we all predicted that the first that he will try to deal with is, of course, Israel and Gaza, because it was the easiest one of all three for him to resolve. And indeed, the other two are, of course, Russia, Ukraine, and China, Taiwan. China, Taiwan is not in play yet, thank God, but make no mistake, in my view, it will happen in the next several years. During this term for the president, I'm sure that the United States will have to deal with this issue. It's brewing, and I don't think that the tariff wars is helping that in any way. The Palestinian issue. The 10-7 created some sort of a confusion. If you remember, right after 10-7, we said, well, the big misunderstanding is that a lot of people think that what Hamas did is part of a legitimate Palestinian resistance. Well, first thing to say is that in the eyes of Israel, there was never a legitimate form of Palestinian resistance, which is violence. But the big question is, what's the conflict? What is the conflict? What is the root cause for the conflict? What's the reason for it? So a lot of people say, well, it's land. That's what the Palestinians wanted all along. And a lot of people say, well, it's a clash between two different national narratives. And some people say, well, it's part of a much larger religious conflict between Islam and the West. And they may all be true. But I think in the eyes of the Israelis, 10-7 crystallized that the conflict is not really about land. The conflict is not about land because of the very simple fact that when you look at the history of the conflict, every time the Palestinians were offered a compromise that is based on what we call a territorial compromise, it was rejected. And mind you, territorial compromise at one point, and we're now marking 30 years to the assassination of Yitzhak Rabin in a few days, Yitzhak Rabin was elected prime minister because of the fact that he believed in territorial compromise. Same thing goes for Ehud Barak in 1999, right? So territorial compromise was once the leading political camp in Israel. Most Israelis advocated, including Israelis that you would describe as politically conservative, advocated political compromise. Why? Because the prevailing assumption was that the territory was about land, and at the core of the conflict, that the conflict was about land, and at the core of the conflict, you had a very simple bargain. You give the Palestinians what they want, land, and you receive from the Palestinians what you want, which is peace and security. Then you had the Clinton plan, but introduced in 2000. The Palestinians rejected it, would have given the Palestinians 96% of all the land that they wanted. Then you had in 2005 the Israeli unilateral pullout from Gaza, which again was the fulfillment of the Palestinian territorial fantasy. Look what the Palestinians did with that. Then you had the 2008 Olmert plan. According to Condoleezza Rice, Olmert was willing to give the Palestinians 100% of their territorial demands. And then, of course, you had 10-7. And today, the Israelis are convinced that the unfinished business between Israelis and Palestinians is not the 1967 war, which was over land, but rather the 1948 war, which was over our very right to exist. So the conflict is not about land, but rather it's an existential dispute. That's the mindset of the Israelis today. And in Israel, the governments usually end up doing what the public wants. I know it's peculiar, but even on this issue of the ceasefire, look at the radical elements of the Israeli coalition promise time and again that if Mr. Netanyahu will stop the war, if the government will not achieve the ultimate goal of complete eradication of Hamas, they will quit and blah, blah, blah. And look where they are. So in a very peculiar way, 10-7 changed everything in the sense that the Palestinians lost the number one ally historically, which was Israeli public opinion. The Israelis are no longer with them. The Israelis lost patience with the Palestinians. The Israelis want to disengage. And the same sentiment that happened in the United States, America first, will happen undoubtedly in Israel, Israel first. And you'll see that in the upcoming elections in Israel, which are scheduled for next year, October of 2026. You'll see that the various candidates, they're already gearing up, and they're adopting this language of Israel first. and understandably because, Israelis were traumatized by 10/7. So what are the priorities? What are the things that we will see happening on the ground? So in terms of the international community, the number one priority is the rebuilding of Gaza. Right now, they're talking about beginning the rebuilding of Gaza, the rehabilitation in the parts that Israel controls. Israel militarily is present in about 50% of the territory of Gaza right now. It will be very difficult. It will be very, very messy. There's no doubt in my mind that armed militias in Gaza will attack whoever will attempt to do good, whether it's the Saudis, the Egyptians, the Jordanians, the Israelis, the Americans. It's not going to be nice. It's not going to be pleasant. It's going to be very, very messy. Yet it's something that we will have to do if we want to see a different Gaza in the future. If you may, same thing that the United States did in Germany and Japan must be done in Gaza, and it's not going to be pretty. The second priority is, of course, is the reorganization of political life in Gaza. How do you bring in a centralized form of government to a place that is highly decentralized? Right now, with the crippling of Hamas military capacities, what we see is the rise of armed militias. This could very well be people that were members of Hamas until recently. Now they see an opportunity to rise and take care of the interests of their own clan, of their own militia. We know there are at least 4 or 5 big armed militias in the Gaza Strip right now that are not with Hamas. I'm being told that the Israelis are helping them, training them, providing them with weapons and ammunition. I don't know to what extent this is happening, but Israel has done that before in the Golan Heights and other places, helping anti-Al Qaeda, anti-Assad militias militarily in the Golan Heights. I suspect that the Israelis are doing the same thing in Gaza right now to create a counterbalancing act to Hamas. Whether it will be successful or not, it's too early to tell. And then, of course, you have to be vigilant and stop Hamas's attempts to rebuild. And there's no doubt in my mind that once Hamas will be given some maneuverability, once they will sense that they're having some level of oxygen, they'll try to rebuild very quickly and even resume firing rockets at Israel, because that's the most potent thing that they can do in order to show that they're still alive, is fire more and more rockets, which they can do if they have the maneuverability, if Israel takes off the pressure. Let me just end that part of the conversation with a quote from your very own Yuval Noah Harari, who published an excellent article in Israel. I translated one paragraph in which he talks about why it's so important to keep the peace agreements intact. And he talks about Egypt, and he says, those who argue that the only way to keep Israel safe is to eliminate the military capabilities of any potential enemy should consider the case of Egypt. In military terms, Egypt poses a great threat to Israel than Hamas, a greater threat to Israel than Hamas or Iran. Their military forces number over 1 million people, and unlike Iran, Egypt has a long border with Israel. Does this mean that Israel must strike a preemptive blow against Egypt, destroying the Egyptian army before it is too late? And he answers his own question by saying even the most extreme members of the government do not support such a crazy plan of action. Everyone understands that it is far better to preserve the peace agreement between Israel and Egypt. The point of that quote is to tell you this: Israel did very well militarily, so far not so very well diplomatically. Let's hope that the United States, that has taken the lead from Israel, will help steer the boat in the right direction diplomatically. And with that, let me open the floor and take some questions.
Thank you very much, Ido. Your perspectives is always so insightful and raises many, many questions. Many of our listeners submitted questions in advance. We have questions coming in here right now. I'll start with Monet, who's asking, what about the Druze in Syria?
Yeah, so again, this is one of the tests. how we will know if Ashara, formerly nicknamed Al-Julani, is the real thing? Well, the only way to know it is to see what kind of government he creates. If he's going to create a centralized government that is excluding the minority groups, and there are many minorities in Syria. Syria is a country of over 20 million people with many minority groups. But let's see. And the treatment of the Druze is a litmus test, not just for the Druze themselves, not just for Israel, but also for the entire Western civilization. So right now, the jury is still out. Israel is committed to the well-being of the Druze. To remind you, there are pockets of Druze not only in Syria, but also in Lebanon. And of course, the Druze in Israel have been exemplary citizens of the state of Israel since 1948.
Tony is asking the following. With regard to zero tolerance, there have been reports that Hezbollah is not only rearming, but expanding its reach, and that Hamas is similarly rearming and aggressively recruiting. Are these legitimate concerns? As well, economic considerations aside, given the role of Qatar in harboring Hamas leadership and Turkey's anti-Semitic, anti-Israel sentiments, can they be given a viable role going forward?
Yes, the answer is yes, because the role is given, I'm referring to Turkey and Qatar, the role is given to them by the United States. The United States is considering a much bigger picture than Israel. And so, yes, Turkey is a major player in the region, and the United States traditionally has worked with Turkey very closely. Don't forget that the United States has major military presence. When we talked about the deal that the Americans presented to the world after World War II, it included American military presence. Today, America has military presence in over 250 different locations, which makes the United States, we've never seen anything like it. There was never an empire in the history of civilization that had such significant military presence outside of its own borders, not to mention the aircraft carriers that are roaming around all over the world. So American military presence is quite dominant, and Turkey is a big part of it. And so it's an American decision, not an Israeli decision. Also, please remember what I just said. There's a limit to what you can do militarily. One of the dangers of the success, the military success of the IDF since October 7th. So the IDF miserably failed on October 7th, but since then, we've seen great success. May create the illusion that it's the only legitimate form of operation. And of course, we must learn from our own history that it always has to be a combination of military action combined with diplomatic efforts. And in both cases that we've seen recently, it's the Americans that led the way. The Abraham Accords was actually designed, digested, executed, and introduced by the Americans with very little involvement of the Israelis. And the same thing is with the Gaza ceasefire deal. It was 100% American. And so we have to make sure that we maintain that balance. But yeah, absolutely. Turkey and Qatar may not be great friends of Israel, but the United States has a bigger picture in mind.
We have a question here that takes us back to America. Assemblyman Zohar Mamdani, who is currently a favorable runner-up in New York's upcoming mayoral race in 2 days, has become a vocal figure in local politics, often critical of Israel and of Prime Minister Netanyahu in ways many see as crossing into anti-Israel or even anti-Jewish sentiment. Given your deep experience in New York and understanding of its Jewish community, how do you interpret this new political dynamic? What does it say about the evolving relationship between progressive politics, Jewish identity, and Israel in America's largest Jewish city?
Yeah. So regarding Mamdani, several things to be said. The first is it's not about Israel. Mamdani's rise is in the first place about Donald Trump. It's a reaction. In physics, every action has a reaction. He's the reaction. Very similar to what happened in Canada, by the way, in the Canadian national elections. So Mamdani in the first place is about Trump. The second thing, the rise of Mamdani symbolizes the changing makeup of New York. The people that vote for Mamdani are not necessarily New Yorkers. These are transplants, young people that come to New York. They flock to New York from all over the country, from all over the world, including from Israel, looking for a job. They are members of one particular group, 18 to 24, 26 maybe, feel entitled because they have a degree from a very good university. Usually they were promised that this degree will grant them a career in the nerve center of the Western world, which is New York. And here they come to New York, and all of a sudden they find they have to spend $4,000 to live in a small studio. And New York is not affordable to them. Remember the algorithm, the merciless algorithm. They're unable to deal their products of, if you read Jonathan Haidt, products of overprotective parenting, unable to deal with complexity, not resilient. These are the kids that were talking to the media at Columbia University during the encampment and said, we demand pizza as part of our human rights, right? These are the kids that are voting for Mamdani. This is Mamdani himself, by the way. That's that generation. So no resilience, no experience, no understanding of complexity, no ability to contain nuance. And apparently, he has about 500,000 votes that are his base. Question is if this is enough to bring him to Gracie Mansion. So it's an open question. We will know in a few days if Mamdani was able to win or not. People that would vote for the other candidates, Cuomo and Sliwa, are not necessarily in Manhattan anymore. People want to have children, don't stay in Manhattan. Couples that want to get married and have children, they go out. You find them in Tenafly, you find them in Westchester, you find them in Long Island, you find them in so many other parts of the greater New York area. They're not in the city itself. The traditional, the Democratic base still votes for Cuomo. When you look at the vote of the African American community, when you look at the vote of the Haredi community in Brooklyn, older people still vote for Cuomo. There are some indications that the gap is closing dramatically in the last several days. And the reason for that, and this is the last thing I will say about Mamdani, it has nothing to do with the positions of Mamdani about Israel or about Netanyahu or about the conflict. It has everything to do with the people, with the fact that people realize that there's nothing in his biography that indicates that he is capable of running the most complex urban center in North America, for sure, if not in the world. Let me explain when I say what I mean by the most complex. The number of people coming into Manhattan every day doubles. So it's 8 million people coming in using public transport. It's the largest public transport system in the United States, the largest academic, city-owned academic system in the world. City University of New York has 550,000 students. So to give this highly complex system in the hands of someone never held a job, that's something that is scary many people. And they should be scared, by the way. They should be scared with the very notion. Now, what he says about Israel, I think it's just he knows that this is what the voters want to hear. I don't really think that's on the top of his agenda. I don't really think he cares. I think, again, he's a populist, an anti-state populist. His ideas are populist ideas. The chances of them actually happening are very, very, I don't believe any of that is possible. Free transportation, free food, freezing rent, all those ideas are just, that's what they want to hear, those kids. And they also want to hear that Netanyahu is going to be arrested. That's the whole story, in my view.
Yeah, I guess we'll know the result of this strange story in about 2 days. So with these shifting generational attitudes in the US, especially on university campuses, what can Israel do to rebuild bipartisan and public support in America?
So Israel would need to invest unprecedented attention, money, resources into basically retelling the story of Israel. So there's a whole new generation that um, has no knowledge, no foundation of any valid knowledge about Israel. So it's not just facts. I'm talking about any connection. And what Israel needs to do is reintroduce itself. It's like a blank, open page, blank slate. And it's a major task, because I don't know that Israel is aware of the magnitude of the challenge. Certainly not this government in Israel. And I don't even know that, people say Bennett will be the next prime. I don't know. I really don't know if there's someone in Israel who is fully aware of the magnitude and the scope of the task at hand. The task is to reintroduce Israel to a whole generation. That's not an easy thing. How do you do that? The first thing is you have to invest, do what the Qataris and the Saudis did, um, using the same methodologies. It's not going to be easy because the way universities in the US, Canada, and other parts of Europe, the faculty is appointing faculty. And so they're duplicating themselves. It's not going to be easy to break that cycle, but we will have to invest in academic content. We will have to endow chairs. We will have to cultivate academics that are able to express a more complex view of reality, and the research is representative of the complexity of the situation on the ground. So rather than cultivate academics that are engaged in what Brett Stevens described in his iconic column after the encampments as human engineering. We need to cultivate people that are able to see the complexity of the situation. That's the first thing. The second is an unprecedented effort to bring to Israel influencers. When I say influencers, I don't mean just Instagrammers and TikTokers and all that. I'm talking about influencers from all walks of life, talking about thousands of them every year. And this effort cannot be done directly by the Israeli government. This will have to be funded by other organizations. So take the great work that CFHU is doing in Canada and magnify that by 1,000. That's what needs to happen. Imagine thousands of Canadians, influencers, are coming to Israel every year. That's what we need to do. It's a huge, enormous task. It will cost a lot of money, but it's essential if Israel wants to be in a position that the world sees it in a different light. What happens to a country when the world doesn't care about that country? Ukraine, that's what happens.
Hmm.
When the world doesn't care, the world knew nothing about Ukraine. I met here in America many Americans that couldn't tell the difference between Ukraine and Russia. That's exactly what Putin was counting on. So that's what we need to do. And of course, many other things. If they will continue to push the Jews out, then the Jews will do what they've always done. They'll create their own thing, as the Jews created their own industries, their own hospitals, their own country clubs, their own. The same thing could happen, but hopefully this will not happen.
Thank you. Thank you, Ambassador Aharoni. We have one more question that was submitted earlier, which takes us back into the internal issues in Israel. We've seen massive demonstrations in Jerusalem and across Israel by ultra-Orthodox Haredi communities protesting the new draft law that would require many of them to serve in the Israel Defense Forces, including a rally last week. Given the social, religious, and political weight of this issue, how do you assess the internal divide this is creating in Israeli society?
So I think it's going to be again, the picture is more complex. The Haredi community is not monolithic. There's a big growing number of them, especially young Haredi men and women that do not want to stay poor and they want to have careers and they're ready to integrate. I have even in Israel, I have some students like that. And so it's not so simple. On the other hand, when I spoke about zero tolerance, just as the Israeli public has zero tolerance to Hamas and Hezbollah rearming, the Israeli public will have zero tolerance for inequality, and they want to see equal participation in lifting the burden of the defense of the state of Israel. And if the Haredi will make, if their leadership would have considered making some steps, for example, introducing core studies in their school system, then the Israeli public would have been probably more tolerant of that. But this is not happening. So you can't prevent your children from studying math and English, prevent them from becoming productive members of society, becoming part of the Israeli economy, and then at the same time demand that those who do will continue to fund them. This, again, zero tolerance. That's what you will see. And I believe this is going to be one of the major issues of the next elections. And it's also the soft underbelly of the current government. If I had to give any of the candidates running a piece of political advice, use the term equal participation.
Thank you. Thank you.
Equal participation. That should be the campaign slogan.
Unfortunately, our hour is over, though we have many more questions, but I guess we'll keep them for the next time. As always, really want to thank you for your thought-provoking and presentation and for sharing your deep experience and perspective with us today. We truly are grateful for your time and your leadership and your continued commitment to strengthening the relationship between Israel and the Jewish world. And for those of our listeners who are joining from Vancouver, we are delighted that Ambassador Aharoni will be in our community this coming Friday, November 7th. He will be speaking at Sharet Tzedek Shul following Kabbalat Shabbat at approximately 5:15. So you're warmly invited to join and hear him in person. Thank you all for joining us today. Wishing everyone a meaningful and peaceful week ahead. Shalom and have a wonderful rest of day. Thank you.